Hello and welcome to the presentation on classical East Asia and Oceania. This presentation covers some of the key points from those two regions during the classical period, and like some of the other presentations, breaks the strict periodization of 600 BCE to 600 AD as the period for the classical period. We're going to go a little bit farther than that in both directions, actually, with the Polynesian migration. So the two things we really want to talk about are this area, which is East Asia, mostly China, Korea, and Japan in this case, and the area made by connecting New Zealand to Hawaii and then to Easter Island and back to New Zealand. This triangle is called the Polynesian Triangle, and that's where a lot of our action happens this video. Let's go to East Asia first. In the classical period, where we're going to be focusing on three of the main classical kingdoms in East Asia. There are more, so I'm just limiting it to these for the sake of being able to cover things in some depth. First of all, Han China runs about roughly from 200 BCE to 200 CE and is incredibly influential on the rest of East Asia. Shilla Korea, which runs from just at the beginning of the Common Era to 935 in the Common Era, and it goes through many changes during that time. So that's a really long time, a lot of changes in Shilla. And finally, Heian Japan, one of the glorious classical periods of Japan, and that doesn't begin till near the end of Shilla and until almost more than 500 years after the end of Han China. And so we see a lot of the same things happening in Heian as we see in Han, but it happens a lot later, definitely past the end of the classical period. But I think in some ways it still fits really nicely with those other two. Let's start with Han China and see some of the things that they developed that really influenced these other two civilizations. The first thing to notice about Han China, of course, we want to remember this just to contextualize things, to connect it to the rest of the world, is that they conquered the Taklamakan Desert. And this is really important because it enables them to, if you filled in the blank correctly, provide security along this portion of the Silk Road and really develop the commerce aspect of the Han Empire. And you can see that's a big extension over the previous Qin Empire. And commerce is really important to the Han, and really one of the ways that they do that influence comes from Han China to influence Korea and Japan. And so one of the first things that you might recognize are these Chinese coins, and they were the de facto currency of Korea and Japan for a long time. Coins minted in China were used in Japan and used in Korea as money. Another thing is the Confucian system in China, and this is specifically a painting of Confucian exam system, which allowed for a theoretical meritocracy where China could select the best and brightest to become members of its bureaucracy, and that has a huge influence on Korea and Japan as well as just Confucianism in general, and that flourishes. The exam itself, in fact, begins during the Han Empire. And finally, Buddhism. Buddhism comes to China during the Han Dynasty. It spreads gradually, and by the time of the Tang Dynasty, 500 years later, it's quite an important part of China. And by that time as well, it had spread to Korea and Japan, and its introduction to China is key to its introduction to those other two countries. And we'll see that Buddhism brings with it a cultural package of sorts. So let's see how that influences Shilla. This is Shilla at one of its largest extents. You can see with its other two Three Kingdoms period Korean states, Goguryeo and Baekje. And Shilla, just from my personal bias point of view, is the best of the three. Goguryeo is great. It defends Korea against China. Baekje is interesting, has its own kind of developments, but especially artistically, poetically, Shilla is an incredible period of Korean history. It lasts so long and has so many great things. So one of them is this is Cultural Treasure of Korea, number 83, the Buddha of the future sitting in meditation, and the amount of just feeling that is captured in this statue is incredible. Compared to other statues, we've talked about this, perhaps if you're in my class, we've talked about this, how this was probably sculpted from an actual model compared to some other Buddhist statues which were usually quite stylized and were not sculpted from life. So, and this shows how, one, Buddhism influenced Shilla, came from China, definitely became a huge part of Shilla life, but also that Shilla and other Korean kingdoms as well developed that Buddhism. They didn't just take it straight away from China, they developed it in its own way. And so that combination of cultures was a key word from part 5, syncretism. So this Buddha is a small example of syncretism, definitely dominated by Buddhist styles, but has Korean styling as well. At the same time, Korea managed to maintain a lot of its traditional Korean roots. This crown is an excellent example of the fact that especially early Shilla kings saw themselves not as Buddhist, but as shaman kings. And so at the same time as Shilla was heavily influenced by China, it also continued to develop traditional beliefs. But still, the influence of Buddhism is incredible. And some of the most fabulous pieces of Korean art were created during the Shilla period, including the Buddha and the Sokuram Grotto. Japan's Heian period also shows incredible influence from China, but also the ability of the Japanese to both take that influence and change it in a syncretic fashion to create something that is Japanese, and also the continuation of traditional Japanese methods. So Japan responds at this period of time in the classical age similarly to Korea. But one thing to remember is that Japan is doing this significantly later than Korea was doing it, and that a lot of the Chinese culture that comes to Japan comes through Korea, and that Japan's ties with Korea are much closer than its ties directly with China. But a really great example of the influence of China on Japan in this period is the capital at Heian. Heian is modern-day Kyoto. It's here on the island of Honshu, and this is a map of it. And you can see that it's quite laid out in an orderly fashion with straight rows, and it was based on the Chinese imperial capital in Xi'an. That was the point of this organization. So Heian-kyo, the Japanese capital of the Heian period, was purposely modeled on the example of Xi'an, which many of you have visited, perhaps. This is the Byodo-in temple in Japan. It's an example of the Buddhist influence and how that Buddhist influence brought with it some very Chinese-styled architecture. But as that Buddhist architecture came to Japan, the Japanese modified it to suit their own tastes, and this is a great example of that. Another important cultural item from the Heian period is the Tale of Genji, which is the world's first novel. And this is interesting because it's a illustrated version of that tale. So this is a scene from the Tale of Genji in a painting, and it shows both a combination of you have clear influence of that Chinese painting style here, but on the other hand, if we look at this closely, you have a lot of very strong differences. For one thing, these are women being depicted. You see very traditional Japanese clothing styles, although we should note that those are made of silk, and some of that silk would have been imported from China. So just to wrap up the East Asia situation, I want to remind us that we have China. The Han Dynasty is very much at the center of the East Asian situation, and it influences Korea and Japan, but Korea and Japan are able to take those influences, make them syncretic, merge them with their own traditional patterns of culture, and that's a really interesting thing about the classical period in East Asia. So we're going to move now to Polynesia and the migration that took place there. And we think that this began possibly as early as 5,000 years ago in Taiwan, which is up here, and then it actually spread down into these areas, which are called Melanesia and Micronesia. But the exploration that we're really interested in is, again, to this triangle, the Polynesian Triangle, which happened probably from about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago to about 1,000 years ago, during that whole period, a very long period of time. Like we said, migrations take a lot of time, and let's see how they managed to do this, because these are incredibly long voyages where the islands that they're visiting, you can just see this from the map, the islands are much, much smaller than the land, than the water that surrounds them. So this is a feat of navigation that really went unmatched for hundreds of years after the Polynesian migration. They used ships like this. This is a reproduction of a Hawaiian design called the hokure, and it's on your assignment. And these allowed them to sail against the wind, sail long distances, And they used incredible navigation techniques. One of the most interesting is their ability to use navigation of the stars. So they had an incredibly vast knowledge of the stars. It's called celestial navigation. And one interesting thing about that is that they didn't have a clear writing system. So if this would have been a knowledge that was passed down by word of mouth and by teaching, and then held in the memories of the navigators. So the navigators must have been incredible people. But not just stars. They also used the waves. The patterns of the waves would be different around different islands. And they used birds, kind of in the same way that Noah does in the story of the flood, where they would send birds out to see if they come back or not. And we think they probably used those three methods together to bring a really effective system of navigation. Another question might be, how do we know that these people spread out to all of these different areas during this time? Well, one of the main ideas is linguistic, and we talked about that during the Bantu migration, is that we can see very strong connections between the languages spoken through all of those languages, all of those areas, and that tells us those people were closely connected. But another thing is that the technology and the crops that were grown and used in this triangle are also quite similar and show and suggest similar roots. And moving forward from today, these days genetic scientists are using genetics to possibly trace the ancestors of these people, and then we would have more and more evidence for this kind of migration. I want to talk a little about the common crops that the Polynesians brought with them. Another interesting thing is that these are the first people, these are real explorers. Nobody else lived on these islands before the Polynesians got there. And that's a big difference between the European explorers of later centuries. So first of all, crops, we're talking about things like bananas, taro, yams, coconuts. Were the kind of crop that the Polynesians brought with them. All of these things are both hardy, they grow in a variety of circumstances, and they're also things that can stay fresh and still stay fertile. They can still be planted after a long trip on a boat. They brought with them these cute animals, pigs, chickens, and dogs. Now, in both cases of the animals and the plants, not all of them were found on all of the islands. Some of the islands were not suitable to grow all of the plants, or were not suitable to have all of the animals. And finally, they have a really interesting and very complex array of, these are mostly weapons, but they'd also have different kinds of tools, very famous for their fish hooks, which were often carved. And so you have a very well-developed culture spreading along these Polynesian islands. So hopefully you'll learn more about that as we move through the discussion, and hopefully this can provide a strong basis for your worksheets on East Asia and Polynesia. Thank you very much for watching, and study hard.